Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Bob Flake with Xanogy. We are a consulting firm that we work with nonprofits only, and we sponsor what we call our Nonprofit Executive Webinar Series. And it's a series, today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about trends in grant management. And what these webinar series are for, they're just to share best practices for nonprofit professionals. And in doing that, we'll show you some technology that you might want to use to make your business, your organization run more smoothly. We may just talk about some best practices, and it could be a mix of both in the seminar, depending on which seminar it is. And at the end, I'll go through a couple seminars that are coming up. So today, we're going to talk about grant management and that life cycle of grant management, what some of the best practices are, what technology solutions are out there for grant management to make that easier for you on a day-to-day basis. And we'll start with talking a little bit about the grant life cycle. So we start with searching for a grant, and there we're doing folks are doing research online, or they may even have some solutions that they've implemented to help them find grants. It may be that you're looking at renewing a grant that you've had in the past, or you may be familiar already with some grant sources. So we're in that phase of looking for grants where we're going to start then applying for them. In the next phase, in that phase, we need to have a lot of different information, right? We need to be able to give information to our grant writer and have things available for them so that they can get that application completed and not have so much asking folks for things. So a lot of times, we've got to go ask accounting for some information. We've got to go ask some people in operations or in the field for other information. And one of the things we can do is if we have a good technology background, we can have a lot of this information already set up and available at someone's fingertips. We'll talk about some ways to do that. Then we have to start accounting, monitoring, and data collection for the grant. And those kind of go together simultaneously, right? So you're out, you're doing what you said you would do for that grant money, whether that's providing meals or providing some types of services to the community, what have you. Those are going on at the same time as we're accounting for those as bills come in, as we're doing grant reports, and that leads to reporting. And this cycle just keeps going on as new grants are added in and as new grants are awarded, etc. So several things have happened in the last few years when it comes to grant management and even grant seeking for that matter. Is back in 2014, we had the DATA Act, or the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, and that first set of requirements actually started with HHS, and those grants have to have their first reporting in May of 2017. And what that did is it made the grantors need to standardize the collection and reporting of federal grant data. So all federal grants, and when I talk about federal grants, we have to remember that, we might receive a grant from the state or from a local organization or from maybe even another nonprofit organization that might have been a grant that was originated from the feds. So it could have been a grant to the state that was then passed through, and the state might have passed that through to one nonprofit or multiple nonprofit organizations, which then may even pass that money on down to even smaller ones to get to a local level. So even though you may not have a federal grant, you might still fall under requirements for a federal grant because the grantor that needs to ultimately comply with the new standards will have to do that in the format that the federal agencies want. So that's underway now, and we'll see that happening across all different types of federal grantor agencies. And with that, some of the goals that they had in creating these standards and the collection of that data is to be able to aggregate that data in a way that it can be reported and will be easier for fraud detection and for misuse of funds. So ultimately, they'll be able to compare organizational data from multiple sources and see that, one organization was providing services that cost, 10 times more than it costs another organization, and be able to take a look at that and see why. And also maybe able to find some organizations that are doing things more efficiently, and let's hope that we're looking at those examples as well, and not just looking at it from a fraud standpoint, but looking at it as how did some of these other organizations do it so much better, and taking learning lessons from that. Now we can hope that that will happen as well. So we do have the Data Act there, and there's whole seminars that you can go online and take about the Data Act and how that affects grant reporting and grant getting actually as well. So simple Google search for the Data Accountability and Transparency Act will come up with a lot of data that you might find useful. It'll also, if you like to read all the legalese, all of that's out there as well. It's rather dry. If you have insomnia, it's probably a good way to fall asleep some night. There's also classes that are offered by grant professionals across the country. Okay, there we go. There are also some new things with OMB Uniform Grant Guidance in the last few years that we need to talk about when we talk about grant management. And that is that it is now okay and recommended to collect your data and store it on an electronic format. Not only all of your documents like receipts and things like that from your vendors, receipts from employees when you take, they're out in the field and maybe they have an organizational credit card or a procurement card, or maybe they make purchases on their own and get those reimbursed. Those receipts can be stored electronically now. Also, the sign-off on those receipts can be done electronically too. So we can set multiple ways to set up for electronic approval these days, and I'll show you a couple of them, some with tools that are less rudimentary and some that are pretty advanced. There's an award number that needs to be assigned to every federal award, and that may be needs to be assigned to within your system somewhere as well. And that could just be related to that somewhere, but it's important to know that that must follow with all of that. Internal controls must be in place and they need to be documented. That may not be new news, but it is out there in the forefront now that these internal controls, because we need to be able to do the last item on the list, which is to provide some risk evaluations in our request for a new grant. So whenever we're looking for a new grant today, we'll need to add in risk evaluation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And a result of these new guidance and from the Data Collection, or Data Act rather, is that we're told that indirect costs are going to be more easily compensated because they will be more standardized and easier to come across. So what are some of the best practices? So we're going to talk about these 5 different categories for 5 different best practices for grant management. The first one being risk assessment, and then we'll talk about policies and procedures, which go hand in hand with accounting internal controls. Because without the policy and procedure, we don't have a document in which to make sure that our internal controls are set up properly and working. Budget controls, very important when you have a grant, is knowing where you're at with that budget at all times. Monitoring, and then talking about reconciliations and why those are important. So some of these are in that first phase of the grant cycle where we're seeking our grant, and some of those are during our performance of that grant and on the reporting and accounting of those grants. So they go across the whole life cycle of a grant in the case of these best practices. So in our administrative departments, and I realize every nonprofit has a different size and different goals, and that just because you're a nonprofit, you don't work the same, and you might be even providing the same services as another similar nonprofit, but the organization might be set up a little bit differently, and the way that you handle grant management may be different as well. So sometimes these, when I talk about administrative, financial, and operational processes, sometimes those fall under the same person or under the same persons in an organization, and other times they're distinct. But I kind of broke them out into the administration side of grant will be policies and procedures. So we've talked about that a little bit. Your program budget reporting, so getting that program budget put together and reporting against it with actuals falls under administration, not necessarily being put together through the accounting process and finance process, right? But administration has to help make sure that those are out there and that those are being looked at and that we're abiding by allowable charges, et cetera. Setting up grant deliverables calendars. Everything with a grant is date driven, right? So what date do we need to have the application need to be put in? What date do we have to sign that we're accepting that money? When do we need to have the forms in so that the money can be sent to our bank account? When do we need to have financial reports in? When do we need to have other types of reports in for the different deliverables that we might have for that grant? And we'll talk about ways to that folks use to keep track of those more easily. Access to grant information. Administration needs to help us out in getting, or the administrative process of making sure that we have the ability, or that really we're providing transparency around the whole grant process and providing information to our employees so that they can effectively go out and seek new grants. So it may be, you know, having your company or your employee bios available so that on a SharePoint or on a network drive that everybody can get to, or everybody that needs to get to has access, so that, you know, those bios are there, so that the next time our grant writers out looking for new funding and they need to put together their package, they don't have to ask for so many things. So if we make those available, then, as an example, keeping those bios out there, keeping, you know, prior performance information available, those types of things really help on the grant getting side. So at the end of the day, you know, we have some financial and operational processes as well, and those being that we have, at the end of the day, we need to present a grant report. And that grant report sometimes is simply a report of actual versus budget for some, and for some we need to also put in our outcome measurements, and then maybe a combination of that data together to get to what a unit cost was for delivering a specific service. The inputs into that grant report come from multiple places, and sometimes these are different systems, and more today I see that folks are using multiple systems to track things, because in the way that technology works today in the cloud, we have folks that are creating products that are very niche to, or very what we might call best of breed, for recording employee expenses, for creating budgets, for purchasing, for timesheets, for accounting. And in the more modern solutions, we have the ability to have all of these different products kind of talk to one another. And I kind of think of it this way. I think of that we go and we buy our favorite phone, whether that's an iPhone, an Android of some sort, or a Windows phone. I guess those are not available anymore, but you kind of get an idea. We go and we buy a phone, and it does all of that, the things we needed to do. It comes with the texting and the ability to make a phone call and a few things that are just inherent with the phone, right? Then we go and we decide that we want to buy apps, or sometimes apps are free, and we look through the ones that we want, and we decide that we want to use a specific app to satisfy a need that we have. And that app works on the phone, and sometimes that app works with other apps that are out there. So I kind of think of modern accounting systems as ones that come with that backbone of your general ledger and your core purchasing and things like that. But outside it, you might have an app to it for budget that really hones in on the budgeting process, and the same with purchasing and employee expenses and timesheets and payroll. And for outcome measurements as well, there's products out there that allow you to collect data from what you're needing to measure in the field as it pertains to that specific grant. So that said, we'll take a minute and we'll go through the different best practices, and one of those now is a risk assessment, and a risk assessment needs to be included now when you're applying for a grant. And in that risk assessment, what you're doing is you're basically telling the grantor, hey, you have very little risk in giving us this money. We've had great performance in the past. Here's our prior funding audit reports. Here's how we implemented and did a successful grant in the past. And you're giving them all of those statistics. And you're giving them the data to show that you can do a good job, so that it shows them that you have limited risk. And if you have any audit findings from either a past A133 audit or whichever, or maybe just a funder's audit, it's always good to put in there to explain to them how you've addressed those audit findings and made corrections for going forward. So, they may have found that, there was, you needed to have more separation of duties, which sometimes is hard in a smaller nonprofit, right? We're not just sitting and having a lot of money to be able to go buy resources to help us out in accounting. So a lot of times we have to wear multiple hats or ask folks in different departments to help us in creating that. So the more that you can do to have all of these things at your fingertips, and again, out there for your grant writers, as far as risk assessment, then you can to have have more success in getting a new grant. So again, just emphasize your past performance there. And it may not even be for the same type of grant. It can just goes to show that you have the proper internal controls and other things that are best practices put in place so that you can succeed with that. So there are policies and procedures and internal controls. And what you'll want to have is, and show this in your grant applications, that you have a formalized policy and procedure, that it has been approved by the board, that you have it readily available to your employees. You might have that, again, on the SharePoint. So a lot of people will keep things on SharePoint or on a shared drive on the network. And that's, I've also seen it, sometimes folks will have a place where people go to enter in their time, or where they have an employee, for lack of a better word, employee portal, where they can go to enter in their time, or maybe pull up their paychecks from the past, or check what benefits they have. I've seen a lot of times that folks will put the policy and procedure manual there as well, so that it's somewhere that folks are logging into regularly and they can see that. And in that, you should have some of what you want your grantor to know is that you have already addressed in there what your approval workflows are for charging something directly to a grant. So when a bill comes in or when someone requests something, are they going, what is that process that you have for allowing that to be charged to the grant? Is that going through, a grant man? Was that going through the employee doing a purchase order, then having that request approved by someone else, and then move along into maybe even the budget manager for that grant, reviewing it to make sure that it's, number one, that the funds are available, and number two, maybe the person that's administering the grant or the grant manager might be looking for whether or not it's an allowable charge. So just showing that you have those things in your policy and procedure, and also what your procurement policy is. So how are we going out and spending money? And there's a lot of, in the CFR 200 information online, you'll see that they're looking for procurement. There are some particular procurement rules when you get into large dollar amount purchases, and those are available in other webinars and things online as far as what those caps are. But what you want to make sure is that in your policies and procedures that you have your procurement of goods policy in line with what the statutes require. So you might have to have over a certain dollar threshold. You may need to have 3 bids. And you might actually be more aggressive than what the federal policies are, policies that you need to follow are, and that maybe just internally your board or what have you may have decided that you would have, it makes more sense that at $25,000 you need to have 3 bids to procure any item. So, and what those approval workflows are for that. And again, those can be electronic. So what we see today, the trend that we see at grant management is that folks are taking and looking at the current systems that they have and either adding on functionality, changing systems if they need to, or adding third-party functionality that allows them to have workflow approval for the purchase of goods and or services. And that may even be as for employee expenses. And just kind of as a little example, I'm going to show you, we work with, let's see, I have my cell phone turned on here and connected to my phone, and I'm just logged in just to kind of show you that this is one of the things that we can do, or some of the technology that's out there today for expense reimbursements. And this is just for an employee expense reimbursement. It could also be their the credit card that they're attached to, or the procurement card, depending on how your organization is set up with your bank. And what people can do today is from their phone, so this is making it much easier, and everyone hates doing expense reports, right? I haven't met a person that enjoys doing it. But what can be done today with little effort is we can do this from our phone. So if I have one here, I'm going to add an item to my expense report, and if I have a receipt, I can click my camera button, and it's going to, I'm going to just take a quick picture here. I can get that on there. So here's a little metro fare that I paid. So I'm going to take that picture, and then I'm going to save it. And so now I have a receipt attached to it. I can put in how much it was. I can choose what, in my case, I call it a project. I could, that could be your grant category. What was that for? That was for travel expenses. You can create your categories that are then tied to your GLs, and then if you're keeping track of things like class or department or division or project or what have you, you could do that. Is this billable, reimbursable? So this is, I'm going to have that reimbursed to me. I could fill out what department that belongs to. So I'll choose that, and I'm going to, now I'm forgetting something. The amount, $4. So I can save these changes. When I'm done with my expense report, I can submit it, and then what the software does is it gets set up so that you have a workflow that says if Bob turns in as receipt, it needs to go here. And it may even have further definitions around that, but if it's charged to a certain department, it goes to another person to look at. If it's over a certain dollar amount, it needs to go to someone else. If it's charged to a certain grant, it goes to a certain grant administrator, et cetera. So a lot of tools are out here now with workflow built into them. And in this case, it's for employee expenses. This can also be for procurement. So if I were to need to purchase something for a grant or a mix of grant and non-grant expenses, I could enter in a purchase order the same way, either via my phone or through a web browser, and submit those and have those approved by the parties that need them. Then, if we're using third-party applications, a majority of them, any of them that are modern in nature, will allow you to export that data. A lot of times that data will just automatically sync with your accounting system. So depending if that interface has already been built or if they have an existing interface that ends up being an accounts payable invoice or a purchase order, depending on how your system works in your accounting system of record. So at the end of the day, all that data is in one spot. Excuse me, so sorry. The other thing that in policies and procedures that we want to make sure that's addressed when it comes to a grant is how are we determining to charge a labor to that grant? And what I've heard being in the field in the last couple of years is that grant auditors are now wanting to see the timesheets that people are turning in, and whether those are electronic or whether those are on paper, that doesn't, that's a point. They want to see them, and they want to see that they are complete in that it's showing the full amount of time that they worked during that period, and they want to see what they did during that time, what part of it was attributable to the grant that they're being recharged to, and what part is applicable to another grant, which part is applicable maybe to non-grant activity that maybe becomes part of an indirect cost pool later. That's a whole other conversation, but they're getting a little bit more strict in that. So what I've seen over the years is that people a lot of times will take and their employees and they'll just take however they were budgeted to work, and they'll just use that as how they're applying their labor throughout the year. And that's just not becoming as acceptable anymore, because we know that because I'm budgeted to work 50% on one grant all the time, that might not be how it actually happens, just because new grants are added in, there's grants that have different cycles than one another, and the grantors now want to see how things are entered in specifically. And there are a lot of applications out there, even using some of the payroll service providers, that will allow you to enter in your time via the web or via a phone app like the one that I just showed, where we can capture our labor on a daily basis and enter that in. I've seen it from the extreme of folks putting that, putting every day, typing in what they did in Excel, or keeping track of how many hours they worked in each of the under different grants or programs, departments, what have you, and using that, and then the payroll department having to take all of that data and put it all back in and summarize it into the system. I've seen folks take it to an extreme of everybody clocking in and out from their desk or from their phone or from a time clock every time they start doing a new task. And sometimes that's just done through your web browser as well. There's a multitude of ways to get those done. It's really a matter of getting your policies and procedures set up and showing how those labor charges are done. But there are a lot of apps out there today to help in collecting that timesheet data. That's probably something we dislike more than doing an expense report, is doing our timesheet. Again, I haven't met anybody that loves doing their timesheet. You also want to have in your policies and procedures any grant-specific policies. So sometimes a grant, you may not think to put in a whistleblower's policy, but as part of accepting a grant, sometimes there's policy that has to get put into your policies and procedures. So be aware of those. So two frequent ones are drug-free workplace and whistleblower policies. So you'll want to make sure you've got those in there. Always good to update your policies and procedures and review them. I know it's one of those daunting tasks that we can never get to, but it's an important one because a lot of times the auditors are actually looking for these specific things now. So following that up with the second part of that, which is our accounting and internal controls, is we need to be able to make sure that we can have good separation of duties. And again, sometimes that's hard in smaller organizations, but there are ways to involve other folks in the organization. One example is I have a client who doesn't have very many people in the accounting office, and they actually have one of their board members, they have their treasurer do their bank rec. So they make sure that bank statement ties out, and they're actually then able to look at every check that had come through and all the deposits. And it's just another way of separating those duties and having that second set of eyes looking for fraud or misuse of funds. So, you know, that's one way of doing that. And a lot of software packages these days, especially if you're using something in the cloud, may have a specific type of license that, or at least security around the license that allows you to give access to a board member or a volunteer to handle some of those separation of duties issues on a, you know, since it doesn't have to, they don't have to connect to your servers and things like that. It's all in the cloud. Then you're able to find those tasks of people external to the organization, but yet part of your board or volunteers, etc. You want to see documented approvals. So, you know, great that we have the policy on purchasing. Let's make sure that it's documented, that when we have an invoice, we have the backup to it to show that it actually was approved and approved in the manner that we, the policy and procedure said. Whether that means there's a piece of paper that got passed around the office, not the most efficient way, but, you know, sometimes that's where we find a lot of our clients are still at, or through having a workflow in that we'd be able to go back and see on anything that an auditor pulled, and sometimes systems are able to implement workflow. We can actually go back and drill down into a document and see who approved it and when, and that is totally legitimate now with under the new guidance. Make sure receipts provide enough detail. So in the receipt that I had there that I took a picture of, I probably should have put in there a memo of why I was spending that $4 on the Metro, because maybe I was going to the movies during the day to take a break, who knows, at lunch. I needed to hop on the Metro, but so we probably want to have some additional information there. Time and labor costs. We want to show all the employees' activity again. We want to make sure that we're recording non-grant time as well as grant time. And a lot of that's because a lot of employees might be paid hourly, some might be paid salary. So if they work a 12-hour day, their rate that should be charged for the grant might be different, right? And the amount of benefits. Whereas if someone's working overtime and, you know, you have to make decisions on where that overtime is being absorbed. Is that being absorbed from our unrestricted funds, or is that being absorbed through to a grant? So we want to take a look at that. Some grants don't allow overtime. Some grants allow overtime as long as it's, or they'll allow it to be charged for the standard rate for any overtime rate. So you've got to find somewhere else to charge that to. Something else that just popped into my head here too is, another thing that I forgot to put in the presentation altogether is tracking your in-kind donations. That may be something else that needs to, we need to have some policy and procedure around that as well. Monitoring budget. So you need to be able to easily develop a budget and be able to monitor it, and monitor that with commitments and encumbrances wrapped around it at the same time. And what I mean by that is that what I find a lot of our customers end up having are Excel spreadsheets that are getting passed around, and someone is collating them all together and creating this monster Excel spreadsheet that has links to all of these different places. And if one of the links is broken, then we have bad data, and that's just no fun. And then to top it off, then usually that data has to be put into some other format and either uploaded into your accounting system, or it needs to be manually typed in, which is even more onerous. So there are a lot of solutions out there today for budget. What I was going to do is just show a quick video of one that we have customers that use. There are others out there as well. This is an informational seminar, but I'll just play this couple-minute video just to give you an idea of how some of the things can work in a modern budgeting accounting system. Okay, so what we've seen there is that we're taking, if you're doing those in Excel today, what we're doing is we're able to take all of that and centralize all of the budgeting process around in the cloud, and it's connected to your accounting system at the same time. So at the end of the day, we're saving a lot of time by not recreating our chart of accounts into Excel and then moving data over, and it's more collaborative, and it's more enjoyable for employees to be able to use a tool that helps them out a lot. One point I'd like to make, and this is about a lot of the budgeting tools that are available today, is that it's pretty easy to do. I'm not going to say easy to do a budget. I'm an accounting person, so it's kind of relative, right? To come up with a budget for someone who's not an accounting person, to say we need to have this much mileage and we need this much for office supplies, because you can make a list and go get prices and figure that out. Where it's a little more complicated is on the personnel side. And with most nonprofits, that's where most of the heavy lifting is on budget, is around the whole budgeting of personnel and benefits and things like that. And a lot of these tools, or I would say any that you would ever go look at, you want to look closely at their ability to budget the people costs and make sure that it's pretty easy to do that and be able to spread their costs across the multiple programs and departments and grants and all different things that folks do in a nonprofit today. So being able to easily develop those budgets and then being able to monitor them, whether typically that's going to be within your accounting system or within dashboards that are created in accounting that non-accounting folks can use. We can monitor against those budgets. It's also becoming more common for people to create commitments against the budget because grant money is getting harder to come by and funding is smaller, so we're needing to make sure that we count. Number one, we want to make sure we use every penny of it, but we also want to make sure that we don't overspend because we may not have anywhere else to pick it up. So what a lot of folks do now is they're creating commitments and or encumbrances, same philosophy, where if I go and determine that I need to buy a chair and I'm going to charge that to a grant, then I'm going to create a request for that. That request then can become a PO, which is then a commitment against that budget. So that when someone who is approving that request sees that, hey, Bob's requesting a desk for $150 against a budget, and we want to make sure that we have that money available. And we don't want that just to be whatever's come in that we have bills against. We want it to be my budget minus what I've actually spent minus what I have committed already. So we're at that very detailed precision of where we're at with the budget. And that allows us to be able to have our up-to-date budget versus the actual reporting. So those are things that can be implemented in systems today to monitor where we are with the budget so that we have great budget controls. And again, that's one of the things with our risk assessment is to show that we have these tools and we're able to accurately maintain our budget during the year. Then we have monitoring, and this is where we hop into monitoring the program and how it's been doing, making sure that we're sticking to our policy and procedure. So has that been done? You know, looking at, it's sort of auditing at the same time and making sure that there are reasonable and allowable expenses and that we have that adequate documentation. And maybe where we're also gathering statistics that we might need for number of clients that were served, number of meals provided, number of bed nights, just depending on what those statistics are for a particular grant that you're doing. Reconciliation is next on our list, and that is pretty straightforward, but we don't want to miss things here. So we want to make sure that not only is our bank rec up to date, that seems, you know, like I shouldn't probably publish a financial or do a grant report unless my bank rec is done, but I've seen many times in my 20-something years working with nonprofits on site where there are months worth of bank recs that haven't been completed, but there's grant reports that were done because they needed to get the cash in. And I understand that from a practical point of view. However, we don't know that those statements were right if our bank rec isn't complete. There's no way that I can say that that's accurate. Same goes with credit and procurement cards. So if you have company credit cards and procurement cards, you want to have a system in place, hopefully within your accounting system or procurement system, where credit cards and procurement cards can actually be either imported in or those transactions can be approved online and become part of your accounting record, and that a reconciliation is done against them and the credit card and procurement card statements. Again, our grant report is correct if we don't have all of the charges on it. And that's the only way we know, especially when it comes to credit and procurement cards. making sure just regular account reconciliations are up to date. So, looking through your balance sheet accounts, making sure that everything is balanced and looks good. Fixed assets, we need to be able to make sure we're reconciling those so that we're keeping track of where our fixed assets are, and especially the ones that were obtained with grant funds, and that they're reportable, and making sure that we've done physical inventories of those on a regular basis. And obviously that's not monthly, that's more like an annual basis. But we need to be able to do an accounting of those fixed assets. So again, it's really helpful if your accounting system has a fixed asset component to it, or a third-party one. Sometimes works better because the accounting solution might be very strong in accounting, but its fixed asset tracking might be less than optimal in your situation. So keeping those reconciliations up is really important. So how do we do solid grant management? We have to have a great technology foundation at the bottom, and that needs to support our administrative, financial, and operational processes. So all the things that we talked about, being able to use SharePoint or a network drive in order to give access to folks to bios, using Outlook to have a calendar that is created for each grant and have those dates pop up for the people that are appropriate for, so that we don't miss any deadlines, and for it to remind us. To having reports available, whether that's directly in your accounting system, or I also didn't mention there are grant management systems out there as well, and grant management systems allow us to put together grant packets and to be able to do some reporting on your accounting system against data. So your financial system, whether it's a timesheet, your budget, or expense reporting, et cetera, having all of those in a foundation where it's solid and we're able to pull that data easily and effectively to help us get that grant report that we need for our grantor and keep them satisfied. So one other thing I wanted to show you is something that we've done with the client. Well, we did it several years ago, actually. Is there's a tool in the market that's called Smartsheet, and it's just at smartsheet.com. It looks like Excel, but it has a lot more functionality. So I can actually share sheets. In this case, we just created a sheet where people in the field put in their expenses, and we put it in. You can go out and put in an attachment here. You can lock then it can get sent for approval. You can mark an item as disallowed. You put in the date. The user chooses, what in words, because it's a lot easier for a non-accounting person to just choose what it is. It's travel or equipment. They don't care what 356.05 means. And, they put in a description, who the vendor was, and an amount. Well, this is sufficient enough to pass USAID rules for keeping expenses and tracking them. And it's something that is collaborative and allows you to set up comments that can go back and forth about records, request updates. You can create data entry forms. You can publish it to the web for people to use. You can set up alerts and actions. There's a whole lot of functionality in Smartsheet, and something that I just recommend my clients kind of to look at when they're looking to automate things but don't necessarily have the resources to buy a full-blown package, because this is very economical for a nonprofit organization. You just go to smartsheet.com and you take it from there. So it's kind of free advertising for them, from me. So we are a reseller of Sage Intacct, and that is a full-blown accounting system that can handle grant accounting and grant tracking, that has time and expense and things in it, just to kind of give you an idea of things there where we can make things available and have more transparency in our grant process and You know, there are plenty of BI or business intelligence tools out there today too, and I have a lot of clients that take data from their legacy accounting system and their fundraising system and their grant management system and some operational database, and they pull all that data together in order to create dashboards for use by employees. One of the great things about Sage Intacct is that we are able to pull data from other sources and create the dashboards right within products. So that's something here like how many clients have been served and has what we call a performance card. I've got reports here, clients per program, volunteer effort, meals served. This is right from our accounting system. So these are just, you know, another example of tools that are out there that people are using to help them manage grant better and provide data to the folks that need it. So the grant writer who needs to maybe grab data, the number of clients that were served this year, and maybe drill down into that number and see, you know, here's how many were served that year, here's how many were served this year, and be able to pull some of these reports without having, you know, a deep involvement in accounting. It's just a dashboard where we can go look at this data that could be used for a grant manager who needs to take a look at this in a more view of, oops, look at my role-based one here for a program manager, or grant manager rather. So they could come here and they might even have a feed in here from the Nonprofit Times, taking a look at what's going on in the news today, since we're all news junkies. And it may be set up here to show different grants that are here and what my revenue are and expenses and what the remaining funds are for them. So there are a lot of tools available on the market today, and if anyone has any questions, if you'd like to send those over to me in chat. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. My apologies. And I can take those questions from you. I'll give everybody a minute to do that. And if there are no questions, or another way is you can contact me, bob@zanergy.com. Coming up next in our Nonprofit Executive Web Series is December 19th, 3 Essentials You Cannot Live Without: Budget Tracking, Transparency, and Regulatory Reporting. In January, Engaging Employees with Real-Time Data at a Glance, Reporting and Dashboards. And in February, we'll talk about the software selection journey and how to set about creating a team and getting folks involved to select a new system, whether that be for accounting, fundraising, grant management, timekeeping, HR, what have you. The journey is the same. The end product is the only thing that's different there. So I want to thank everybody for joining me today. And again, you could reach me at bob@zanergy.com if you need anything further. Thank you. Have a great day.